background. My background is actually education and medicine in that. So I kind of got to the dark side about 15 years ago. I've been in business for 15 years. I don't have any major credentials to put behind my name in technology, but if you look at my medical and my education credentials, I got a bunch of them. I started out actually in the web and e-learning field, so we still do a lot of web work today, but then moved into SharePoint. Actually did some dabbling in 2001 and a little bit more in 2003, but I kind of thought it was a kind of a sucky system, so I waited until 2007 when it finally got to something that I felt like I could actually recommend to my clients. So if you're in this session, we're going to be talking only about 2010 here, and so we're not going to be talking about anything around 2013. So if you stay for my second, we are going to be talking about 2013. The other thing that I'm going to kind of talk to you about, and you guys are going to be the first people to hear about this, is we actually just completed a formal usability study on 2010 and 2013 using people that had never touched SharePoint in their entire lives, because I had a conversation from somebody from a big company that exists out in the state of Washington that swore that they got the user experience in 2013 perfect this time. So I decided I was going to test that. So in the first part of the 2013 session, I'm going to talk about some of the results that we had and give you some good information there. So just so that you understand, we're going to have talking about what IA is and kind of going through the process, and then we're going to kind of hit these last two parts when we're in the 2013 session, really looking at how we can do it differently in 2013 and the similarities and the differences in how things work. So the first thing I like to make sure that everybody understands is that the field of information architecture is really a practice. And what I mean by that is it varies and it depends on you. In that there is no step-by-step 100% specific solution that I can give you today that will fix all your problems. It always depends on there. So which makes sure to understand it means there's no single right answer in that. And so me as an information architect, the person that's been doing this for 15 years, that's actually important to me, because if it was the same every time, I'd be kind of bored in that. But since it isn't, I actually have some ability to do things. And I love it that I can go to two different companies that do the exact same thing and build completely different systems because they have different requirements. And that's what we're going to talk a lot about today, is really what is information architecture, why do we care, and then how do we actually implement it in systems like SharePoint. So the first thing I want you to understand is information architecture. So how many people here think they know what it is? Okay, there's a few. How many of you only work in SharePoint? Okay, so let me ask one other question before I start. How many people are currently in SharePoint 2010? Okay, most. How many are in 2013? There are a few. Okay. All right. So what is information architecture? Well, information architecture is really the science and art around how we find information. There's basically four main categories of this. The first one being the information. We have to have information that exists somewhere to actually have some type of information architecture. We also look at how we structure it, how we organize it, and how we label it. The problem is, and the reason that most information architectures fail, is because this is where we stop. In there, we think, well, as long as we build a big pattern and we have lots of sites and we have all that stuff and people have a place to put their stuff, it's all going to be successful. So we're going to talk about why that doesn't work, but why it's also important. We also look at finding and managing. So people have to find something. It's really crazy. You can't just put something out there. People actually have to find it and you be able to use it. And the last part that's very important is there is a scientific part to what we can do in information architecture. But information architecture is still art. There's still a lot of guessing. There's still a lot of trying to understand. There is no tried true that I can run through some kind of formula and say, this is what you need to do. There still has to be that piece where you sit there and say, well, this is what I'm seeing, but maybe this is what I need to do. So why do we care about this? Because we need to be smart. How many people in here would actually like to be smart? Hopefully a few, 1, 2, okay, more than that. And the thing is, when you build systems that users don't understand, people don't use them. How many of you consider yourself an IT pro? That must be a bad term here, yeah. And there. How many of you have ever rolled out a system where people didn't like it? Come on, people, be honest. If you've ever rolled out technology, that's the truth. So the reason we want to understand information architecture is first and foremost because we want to be smart and we want to do things better than what we did in the past. And the other thing is because we want to understand that users are important. The reality is technology is great, features are great, things are cool, but if users don't understand how to use it, we're pretty much not going to be very successful. And most of all, we don't want another IT project to hear everybody tell us why it sucks. So when we look at information architecture, we break it down into 3 basic components. The first is what I like to call context. And so context means that every piece of information in your organization exists for a reason. And there's some type of context that piece of information exists. The great part about it is just because it exists for this reason in your organization doesn't mean in somebody else's it exists for a completely different. Let's take like an expense form. So some companies have a very simple system. Some companies have really complex processes. Let's think of HR. Let's think of any type of information. Compliance. Company A may be a medical company that has certain compliance that goes to the medical industry. Company B may have compliance as well, but it may be more financial. And so the important thing is that you have to understand, you can't just say this is a piece of information. You actually have to understand why that piece of information exists, and every company has it. And it's not only about the why there, but it's also all the machinations that go around that. I mean, I'm sure nobody over here in Europe and the UK have this issue, but in the States we have things called internal politics. And internal politics, sometimes something's very important, sometimes something isn't, but somebody who is very important says it's very important because it's theirs in that. So context is really about understanding why a piece of information exists and all the things around that makes that important. Well, the problem is this second category. This is where we spend all of our time because this is very easy to understand. I can open up a document, I can look at it and I can say, okay, this is a Word document, this is an expense form, this is this right here. It's still very important because we have to understand our content, but just because we understand our content and know what it is, doesn't mean that we understand how people look for it, work with it, and everything else. So it's still important to look at our content, figure out what it is, where it's put, and all those different pieces like that, but this is just one piece of the puzzle. And this is the piece of the puzzle that we spend the most time on because it's the easiest piece to understand in that, because we can look at this. We don't have to talk to people to understand this part. So we just look at it and we say, well, since these are all Word documents, we'll just put all the Word documents over here and everybody will find stuff. So then there's this last group. I tell you what, technology would be so much more successful if we only didn't have these people. Because we'd never have to worry about anything. And this is where we really mess up. Because in the world of information architecture, in the world of that, you have these users. And not only do you have information, and information that exists for different reasons, but you have all these people that need to get to it for different reasons and have different understanding. Some people look at a mouse and they go, I don't know what to do with this. You have all these different experience levels that you're supposed to build a system that they can all be successful in. The problem is instead of trying to actually spend a little bit of time looking at this group and actually understanding them and actually doing something successful for them, it's easier from an IT perspective to ignore them and say, well, this system meets our requirements, therefore we'll put it in place and we'll tell them tough luck. And so the problem is that that's why all these systems fail, is because we don't pay attention to this group. And part of this talk is going to be talking about how we really get to understand what they do. So the important part to take away here is when you understand information architecture, is that it's not about one piece, it's about all of it. You have to understand what a piece of information is. You need to understand why a piece of information exists, and you need to understand how people actually get to it and why they would actually go look for it. So let's talk a little bit about the two concepts that we have to deal with here, which is findability and putability. So the first thing I like to do, and anybody that's seen any of my sessions over the last 5 years, I've been using this exact same slide forever, but I think it's perfect. I like to help set the boundaries on how a user thinks. And they ask a question on the internet, magic happens, and they get a response. And so one of the funniest things that I ever run into out there is when I see some type of IT pro trying to explain to somebody how SharePoint works. And try to tell them, well, you don't understand, this stuff's there, and then search has to crawl it, and then all this stuff there. They don't know, they don't care, they don't understand what a browser does, they don't understand. All they know is they open it up, they put in some words, and it happens. And so you have to understand that when we're building systems, we have to think of users like stupid people in that. Because the reality is there are some out there. I've done a lot of usability tests, and I've been absolutely amazed how somebody won't press a button that says continue, but would press a button that says next in that. And I ask them what the difference is. Well, what am I continuing to do? But the reality is, this is how a lot of people are. We forget that a lot of people are not as comfortable with technology as we are. So we need to understand this and then actually try and plan for that. So what is putability? Well, putability is where we put stuff. And this is really the easy part because everybody has a file share, right? Everybody has a file share somewhere, and this is where you put stuff. The most famous thing in the world is our My Documents, our network share, whatever it is. But this is really about where we store information. And the reason that this can sometimes be successful is because people have an understanding where to put stuff. So as long as I can follow some kind of folder structure or some kind of structure, I can sit there and say, okay, this piece of information should exist there and there. And the reason people like this and they love this is because they don't like to make decisions. People don't like to put complexity. When we start talking about information architecture, we start talking about things like metadata and things like that. Well, if you have more than two pieces, everybody thinks it's too much work. So everybody likes folder systems because I knew where to put something. And there, why do we care about this? Well, because people finding stuff is the most important. Don't ever forget that. People getting to that, but we still have to have some place to put this stuff. We still have to have some kind of logic there. And the funny thing is, so many times in information architecture, we compensate so much more on the side of finding things that we forget that, well, the people actually got to know where to put it too first for people to actually find it. So it's kind of this crazy thing. And organization is really the key to successful finding. So it's not that I always have to drill down to find something, but there has to be some kind of logic in there that people can understand. And like I said, people can't find stuff that isn't there. So what is findability? Well, this is how we look for stuff. And this is hugely important because this is most people in an information world, what they do is they look for stuff. And this is where complex structures tend to fail. Because if I have to click once, that may be okay. If I have to click twice, that might be all right. If I have to click 27 times to get down to a piece of information, I will probably not be successful. And the reality is in any file share, what is one of the worst things that ever happens? Subfolders, yes. And so what happens when I can't find something? What do?
Write a new folder.
You write a new folder and you put it somewhere yourself. So complex systems for people finding don't work. The reason is because if you have a folder structure, I've got to know what you were thinking the day you put that document in there, and it makes some kind of sense to me. And so that's a huge problem and the reason. But we can't ignore that there needs to be that side. And actually, if you want to know one of my favorite things in SharePoint is the ability to be able to use folders to put things in, yet show users a flat view and not show the folder structure. And I love that. And I know that's like sacrilege in a lot of areas because in 2007, we absolutely preached do not use folders. In 2010, I actually believe a lot differently because I can actually see through the folder. And I don't have to show that. But from a putability standpoint, it's so much easier for somebody to go, I need to put this here. So, and the biggest thing you need to understand in the end here is that people don't understand how to find anything. You know how many times I've done a user test and I've told somebody to go find an expense form and they go into search and they type in form, search. And guess what? They never get the expense form first. But the reality is people don't understand how to search. And there's a big culprit that caused this. Would anybody like to guess who's the big culprit? And Microsoft will really like that I say this. But who caused this problem? Google, exactly. Because Google, I can put any word on the planet in, and I can get some kind of response back. So people have this expectation that your system should work like Google. I walk into clients all the time where they say, we just like our search engine to work a little bit like Google. I say, you know what, give me 60 billion in 6 years and I'll see what I can do. And that's always one of the interesting things because people have no idea how much structure's behind that. And there's people working every day to make that better. And they just have it. They just think that somebody plugged in a computer and there's one computer out there called Google and they just go on there and search it. So one of the important things is to understand when you start talking about putability and actually having people find it in some type of structure versus findability, which is maybe having people put stuff in a structure, but having them be able to find it in a more global way, is you have this trade-off between discipline and structure. So structure means that people understand how to get down to stuff. Discipline means, well, you can't just put a piece of content out there and hope that somebody's going to find it. You have to have something around that, whether it's metadata, whether it's some type of departmental process, whatever it is. You have to have discipline when you put in content. And that's really the rub right there. And that's kind of the problem, is that people want to be able to find everything, but users inherently are very, very lazy. They don't understand why they should have to do two things to be able to put a piece of information when I can just drag it onto my desktop and there it is and it's there whenever I need it. So there's always the compromise that you have to make. You're either going to create a complex structure like a network folder system, which overall when people are putting information in it, make them really, really happy. Or you're going to have to follow the discipline side, which means you're going to have to attach information to that document so that people can find it. So let's talk a little bit about our content and what that really means. So one of the first things we have to look at when we're talking about content is really the scenario that we're using SharePoint for. So how many of you use SharePoint for collaboration? Okay, well that's good. Anybody use it as like an intranet, an information portal for their internal people? How about anybody use it for a public website or something for external users? Partners? Okay, there's a few. Well, the thing is that you have to understand in the content world, this is all very different in that. And it's very different because you have different ways people interact with information depending on the scenario that you have. So in a collaboration environment, you really have what we consider a many-to-many relationship. You have many people creating content and many people consuming it and going back and forth in a complex system. So you have a lot of variability in there. And I've worked with a lot of organizations that try to lock that down and make that interaction very specific. And that makes users really unhappy because they all do their jobs differently. But the first thing you have to understand there is there's not a lot in the information architecture world we can do for this level. And the reason that is because it's too variable. There's too many variables that go into it. So if you're creating a project portal for your organization and you have all these different projects, no matter whether they're the same type of project, everybody manages them differently. Everybody does things differently. You might be able to get away with creating some kind of template, a site template that has some standardization around it, but the reality is people interact differently. And the important thing to know about that is you have many to many, which means it's not just a few people putting in the information or a few people getting it. It's a lot of people putting it and a lot of people doing it, and everybody being different. And we spend millions and billions of dollars and pounds on this a year trying to be able to better control this environment, when in reality, all we can really do in this type of scenario is create good practices and try and teach our people how to do things well. But overall, this is insurmountable for the most part for good information architecture, because there's just too much. There's too much to try and get your head around. So the other sides that are much more easy for us to understand and we can actually get a grasp around is more informational sites. So if you have an intranet, well, now you've got an internal system now. And now you've probably got a lot less contributors, so you have a lot less people putting in things. You know, you have the president putting in his weekly address to the troops, and you have communications putting the latest news that's been up about your company, and you have HR updating their documents for the next time that you want to just do a random search and see what all the discipline items are in your organization and that kind of stuff. The good thing about this is now we've kind of got a different model. We tend to have a few contributors, which means we have a better opportunity to be able to train them and train them well, build a system that they have to stay disciplined in and actually manage that, because now we're managing just a small group instead of trying to manage our entire organization and say this is the way it is. The other side that we tend to fall down on is that we have a lot of consumers. We have a lot of people that are looking for this information. So just because we can set some good rules over here for the way people put information in there and work with that information, we can't ignore the side over here, which is you have all these people in your organization that are all going to look for that information differently. And we need to understand that. So one of the benefits that you have somewhat of an internal audience versus an external audience is that they know your language. And so what do I mean by that? How many people in here work for the government? Okay. Where I'm sure it's not the case over here, in the States, we like to use acronyms for everything in the government. And you go inside an organization and they use an acronym. I'll say probably, depending unless that acronym is like PTO, paid time off, most people don't know what that acronym is, even in the organization. So I say the benefit is you have people that know some of your language. And so we start going that we think that we can just use our internal words that we use like there. Like I was sitting in the speaker room with Andrew Connell, and I said, "What are you speaking on?" He says, "Well, I'm going to give a presentation about spa." And I'm thinking, spa? You're going to talk about, did you go to the spa the other day? What is that? And he says, "No, that's single page application." And I'm like, there's IT right there, isn't there? We have to figure out an acronym. I said, well, is there a DAPA? Is there a TAPA? But that's the problem, is we love to do that, and we assume that just because you're in the same company that I am, that I know exactly what you're talking about. And so you have to understand that you do have some benefits, that people do somewhat understand the language you're talking about. But you also have to realize that not all of it. And then you have this other side. So I've been doing this other side for 15 years. And our specialty is coming into organizations that have completely messed up their public website and making it better. And most of those organizations we do in the States is government. And the reason is because of this. They use a lot of their own language. They like to use politically correct terms. They like to use things like really a lot of legalese and things like that, because they have all these processes and proper ways that they need to do things that nobody on the planet understands. So in the States, and I think it's kind of similar over here, government agencies are mandated to have all content at a grade 8 or 8th grade reading level, as we'd call it in the States. So it has to be content that a typical 12 to 13-year-old would understand. How many government sites do you know that you go on that you think a 12-year-old would understand? Probably not that many. And so here we still have this whole concept. Even if you have a lot of people contributing to the site in an internal organization, it's still not as many as the entire population of the UK in that. And then you have this audience, and this audience could be everybody. I mean, just because you may be targeting one group doesn't mean somebody else won't go to your website or something. And so the problem is that, again, we have this opportunity where we can have contributors and we can put some kind of control around them, where they put stuff, how they put it, all those different things there. But this group is so very difficult because this is everybody. So now we have to think in a very different thing. And the reality is they don't know your language at all. So we have to take that into consideration when we're doing these type of things. And that's why I say up here, this is a very noble cause to try and make a collaboration system that's perfect for everybody. But the reality is you're not going to be able to do it unless you only have 10 people in that. Anybody in here have 10 people only? In there, okay. The reality is you have to look at the systems that you can manage from an information architecture type level. And these are the ones that you can, where you're providing some kind of information or you're doing very large processes, something that you can maintain a certain amount of control over and actually decide how information is going to be presented, and it's not some team site that some group uses the way they want to. So how do users use content? That's the first thing we want to understand. And we look at it and we ask some questions. So what is the content? Why does it exist? We want to understand exactly why it's out there and what it means. How do people find the content today? I absolutely laugh how many times I go into an organization that actually did this and learned it, and they did some type of content inventory and they went through all this. Then I said, well, what did you find out? How do your people look for information today? And nobody thought to ask that question. And I always ask, I say, well, if you don't know how people find it, how do you know you got it right? Well, I was talking to the business leaders and they said this is the way they wanted it, so that's the way we do it. And so we first and foremost have to understand how people find that content. Where do people put documents they created? Again, kind of going back to that whole scenario. Where do they put it? How do they do it? How often is the content accessed? You know how many times I've had clients have me build systems for things that never get looked at because they thought it was really important? So this is actually very important, because if there's a document, and I'll give you a perfect example. How many of you have heard of human resources? Yes. And so one of the tactics that isn't really as prevalent today as it used to be is that everybody said the way that you get people to adopt a SharePoint system is put up your HR documents. So let me ask you another question. How many of you have ever taken time off from work? Okay. And the rest of you what? Work every day of your life? Yes, yeah. So in your company, there's probably some kind of form you fill out or some kind of request, right? In there. So this is the way we get adoption, is by having a process that everybody does. How many of you ask for work off every single day throughout the year? Exactly. The problem, the reason HR doesn't work for trying to get people to use a system like SharePoint, or really any system, and the reason HR doesn't work is the framework for how people find information, is people don't look for it that often. Yes, it's important. Yes, I look for time off. Yes, I need to enroll in my benefits. Yes, I need to look up disciplinary, whatever it might be. Those things are important, but I don't do that every day. If we want to get people to adopt and we want to get people to use a system, we actually have to put stuff there that people actually want to use. And guess what? Nobody uses HR very much. Nobody really looks at the President's Corner on the homepage that much. Nobody really cares about that stuff. So we have to look at that. So one of the most important things I look at is how often is content actually accessed? Because if it's something that's accessed once a year, I don't put that on the home page of a system. in that, or maybe I just put it on the home page that one time a year that it's there. But so many times we look at things and we think what is important isn't. So we have to understand how people find it, how often they look at it, and how often they try to access it. That's critical to really understanding what we're doing. And then we have this last piece. So when I first started coming to this conference 5 years ago, this was one of the big things that I talked about all the time. So don't ask me any questions about it because I don't like to talk about security in that. But the reality is, this is another piece that we have to deal with. I have actually had a client that wanted me to put together a site for a CEO that only he could access. And they wanted me to remove myself from having access to it. I tried to explain to them that was virtually impossible, but they wanted it. And I said, why does he want it? So that he can access his files outside of the organization. I said, has he heard of a desktop? And there. But the reality is, this is one of the things that can not only benefit us, but can really mess us up, is when things need to be secured and all of a sudden we're doing it. Because one of the first things that happens when we start adding a bunch of complex security around information architecture is somebody puts something in the wrong place and now it's hidden from everybody because it's secured down to just a small group. So we have to understand all these different pieces to really understand how people use information and what they do with it. So the other thing we need to do there is then we need to understand how our content relates to one another. We're going to find that even though we have content that exists in different areas, a lot of times it is there. You look at this. This is really the thing. So one of the things I really rail about is taxonomy. We in IT love to take words that actually had meaning at one point and make them meaningless. And that's the word taxonomy. I hear people, well, we need to create a taxonomy. I say, what's that mean? They're like, well, we need to create a taxonomy. Taxonomy is actually an order. The original one was phyla, in the way that we looked at information as far as it goes for species, for books. One of the most original ones that was used the most was the Dewey Decimal System. That was taxonomy. That's talking about structural organization of information. And structural organization of information is very important. Can anybody guess why? It's not for the reason you think. It's not so that I know that I need to go and find a snake. It's that I can guess. And this is why it's important, because when we build navigation systems, we have two options. We could put 487,000 navigation items across our global nav so that everybody could find everything all the time. Or we have to put 6 to 10 of them. And here's the important part. People have to guess. They have to guess where to go with that. And that's where taxonomy comes in. So if I'm looking to find a snake, and I'm put up here with fruit, trees, animals, and fish, which one do you think I'm going to go to if I look for snakes? I'm going to go to animals. I hope most of you thought that too in there. But that's the point. Taxonomy really helps us build navigation systems because we start to understand this hierarchical relationship. So if I have 6 links on my global nav, I can make that educated guess. Has anybody here ever taken a multiple choice test? In that, has anybody here ever taken a multiple choice test at a graduate or doctorate degree? In that. What my favorite thing about it is when you did the word associations and you had this word is to this word, and this word is to, and guess from there. And I said, what happens if you don't know what any of the 4 words mean? That's what a doctoral test is like, is you don't have any idea what they are. But a multiple choice test is 2 important things. One, you're supposed to guess the right answer. But if you don't know the right answer, what's the other way you do it? You eliminate the wrong answers. That's what navigation is all about. That's why we can't have 478,000 navigation items, because we can't eliminate it. But we need to know that animals relates enough to snake that people can get to snake from animal in that. And that tree or bird or whatever like that is so different that people can understand that it's not there. So that's why taxonomy is important. But this is not the end-all, beat-all solution of everything. Just putting a good taxonomy in place does not solve your problems, but it is very important because you have this to deal with. So the other thing we need to do, again, kind of going back, we need to understand how people put information and where they do it. So who in your organization creates the content? What type of content do they create? Who reviews it? Who edits it? Who uses it? All the different pieces that need to go in there. Who approves it for publication? Who designs a site that hosts the content? Who sets the policies for managing the content? Who monitors the content? All these different pieces also depend on how we put information and how we use it inside of an organization. And so we have to understand all these different components to be able to really understand where our information could go, how it should be organized, who's going to find it, who has access to it, and all those different pieces. We need to understand the flow of our content. Most content does not exist in a vacuum. It doesn't just miraculously appear and exist and then go away. There's a lot of time there's some type of flow that actually creates that content and manages that. And when we're talking about content, we're not only talking about documents. We're talking about information in a list. We're talking about a business process. We're talking about all those different pieces that make a system work. And so we have to understand that flow of the system, and we have to understand that for the sense, because the reality is if we're publishing something, yet it has to go through a 20-step process beforehand, we may want to determine whether we have that 20-step process right here, or maybe they do it over here, or that kind of stuff. And I will tell you right now, this part right here is what makes me most excited about 2013. There's a lot of things that I'm kind of like, it does there. But this part right here is what makes me so excited. Because 2013 opens up a whole new paradigm for us where we can say, do your work where you need to, and we'll pull the information where we need to. And that's a very unique and very different concept. We could do that in 2010, but we had to do it in a much more disciplined fashion. Now we can actually look at it in 2013, which we'll be talking a lot about in the next segment, where we can do this really across the board and make some really exciting avenues in. As a matter of fact, I'm doing about 2 implementations right now in 2013 where I'm getting to really put this process in place, and I'm really excited about it. There. So when you're talking about the flow of when you're talking about the flow of content, we have to look at, again, why? Maybe it's a document authored by a team in one location that needs to be published to another location. Maybe it's a web page that is created in a development site and then is published to a public site. Maybe it's content that needs to be retained or archived that once it's been proven useful, you still need to keep it in that. There's all these users can move content from a network share to a document library. There's all these different scenarios that we have to look at. So we have to understand not only the content, how it works in that, but also kind of the process that it goes through to get created. So how many of you have ever heard of the concept of card sorting? Okay, so there's actually quite a few that have been here. So what is card sorting? Well, card sorting is a technique that information architects use to understand the structure of a site or a product or information in general. This will be on my slide deck, but right here is a great start. It was written a number of years ago. Card sorting is a very good technique for being able to do this, and this is a definitive guide on how to go through the entire process. And so in card sorting, we really have 2 different types that we do. So this is highly technical, so I apologize. I realize this is not really a technical session, but this is highly technical. We take 4x6 note cards. We write down information that might be in our system. We sit it in front of a person and we say, so here's a bunch of information that we're going to put on our new system. Sort them how you'd see them sorted. And you sit back, and the most important part you do through this entire process, you don't talk. And by the way, this person that I'm pointing at right here does not work in your department. In there. It's got to be somebody outside. But what you're going to find is even though we all come from different areas and do different things, overall, at a high level, we think of information the same way. And so you do this with 10 people. That's it. and you get up to a 100,000 person organization a statistical significance of 85%. And you will be amazed at how you get these patterns where all of a sudden you see that all 10 people put them in the same thing, or 9 or 8 or 7 in that. And what we're looking for here is a relationship between two cards. We're not looking at some global relationship. We're looking at, did people consistently put these two pieces of information together? If so, that's considered a relationship. If they put these two together, and then this one was put with that one, and that one, and that one, and that one, you start to see patterns emerge that really help us with grouping. So in the first concept, we do what's called an open card sort. So we sit them down, we have them go through the process. Ideally, we like it to be no more than 10 groups, sometimes 12, but you'll get people that'll say, put 485 groups up there, and you'll have to say, oh, okay, let's bring them down a little bit. Or you'll see people that put them in 2 in that. And so we kind of want this refinement, but then I'm going to go to them and I'm going to take another technical piece of equipment called a Post-it note, and I'm going to say, would you mind naming this group here and putting a Post-it note on that with the name? And so not only are we starting to understand how people group information, which again really helps us understand that taxonomy that we were talking about, but now we've also, how would they label it? And the amazing part about this, and the thing I enjoy most, especially about working with the government, is that no matter how they thought it would be called, somebody calls it differently in there. We worked with a college, and on that college you go to their site, and they don't have a link for financial aid, they don't have a link for scholarships, they don't have a link for Pell Grants, which is a state or a national program where you can get money and that kind of stuff. They don't have links for that. You know what they have a link for? All about money. Because guess what? When you're dealing with the brain of an 18-year-old, it ends up they just kind of see it as cash in there. And so again, where this was something really tough and there were a lot of instructors that were really upset about this and everybody thought this made them look like an unprofessional institution, this is what I said. Who's your audience? 18-year-olds. If this is the way an 18-year-old thinks and you want them to find stuff on your site, should you do it the way you want it or the way they want it? And they understood that, and it's probably one of the more successful sites in the state of Minnesota for colleges because kids find it very easy, and they think of it as money and that. So we have to understand that, and this is what has helped us do. So when we try to present the results to some business leader, they're going to go, this is poppycock. This is nothing. You can't do that. So we actually take this a step further. Now we kind of decide, okay, here's the patterns we've seen. So here's the groupings we think we would have. Well, now we do what's called a closed sort. So now instead of having people actually name the groups, we set some other cards up there that has the name of the groups on them, and we tell a new group of 10 people to sort these cards under these groups. And we look at it that way, and if we have a correlation that they match up, then we've done a good job. And this is our provability step. And so just so that you understand, I keep saying 10 people. If you want the statistical significance of 90%, you need to do 25. If you want the statistical significance in 95%, you need to do 100. If you want anything up to 99 or above, depending on the size of the organization, you can be well up in the 500 plus number of people you need to do to get that. So overall, if we can get people 85% of the time to the right stuff, would most people consider that successful? Yeah. Exactly. That's the way I look at it. Oh, SharePoint. Let's talk about this. So once we kind of understand this and we've went through all this stuff about how we understand IA, how do we implement it in a system like SharePoint? Well, this is the good news, is that SharePoint actually gives us a lot of options to be able to do it. You have a lot of components here that you can do. The keys and the core components are the things that have existed in SharePoint basically since 2003, some of them since 2001, even a couple of them since Team Services, which was before that. But we have our site collections and sites, so how we group that information, how we segment it out, and that kind of stuff. We have our lists and libraries, so where do we put this information? Is it a Is it a document that needs to go in a library? Is it just a piece of information that needs to go in a list? How that all works. And then we even have one other level of field types. What type of information are we storing? Are we doing a lookup somewhere? Are we having managed metadata come into this? What are we doing to do that? Well, we have all these core components that make up a SharePoint system that by itself, I can build a good information architecture. But that's because I do this a lot. But you can use these core components and not do anything else and be successful. But the really cool thing is we don't have to, because there's a lot of other pieces to 2010 that can make us successful. So next we have the term store. This to me was a godsend in 2010. But most organizations absolutely fail using this. Why? Because it's such a mind bend to try to figure out how to use it. And people figure if you're going to use a term store, you can't have it. As a matter of fact, I was in the speaker's room yesterday, and somebody asked the question, they said, what is the term limit? What is the limit of the number of terms you can have in a term store? Come on, Fabian. In the entire term store. 1 million, yes. So 1 million terms. And I said, why does Microsoft do this? I can only put 1 million terms in here. What am I going to do with that? How about for a term set? 30,000. 30,000, yeah. Some of these must have been sitting in Chris's session and heard the answers there. But 30,000, exactly. What the heck can I do with a 30,000 term set? I mean, you can only put like 30,000 words in that. I mean, how can you do that? So that's the problem, is that people, the term store makes us want to over-architect. They want to think, well, I can't just put 10 words in a term set and use that for something. It's got to be at least 5,000 to make it actually worthwhile. And so the reason most organizations fail with terms is that they try to think of everything instead of simple. Most of the time when I use a term set for an organization, you're talking about the max number I probably have had in a term set is 200 terms. And that was really, really big. Most of the time, I'm 50 or less. Because the reality is what nobody thinks about. When you have to select a term in a term set, first you got to know what the heck you're looking for. And if you don't, you're going to look through everything. How many people are going to look through 5,000 items? There isn't a person on earth that will do that. And so what you have to understand is that you have to be reasonable about this. Term store can actually be very, very effective. But you have to not overthink it. You don't have to break things down to 27 levels. You can keep it simple, and it's okay. That's what it's there for, and it can be very effective. And so I like to use it because you can use it both one-to-one, you're using it for one scenario, or you can use it where you're using it across an entire organization. It's a central management of terms. So if you have things like you want to make sure that every piece of content in a certain area has the department who created it in there, you could have that in a term set, or maybe the process that it belongs to. There's a lot of different scenarios, and you can centrally manage that. So now you go change it here because departments merge together. I mean, a lot of times I work with clients where they're constantly merging and breaking apart and creating new teams and that kind of stuff. You can centrally manage it. But this requires discipline. It requires discipline and not a lot of overthinking. We have content types. When 2007 came out, this was honestly what made me actually start using it and start recommending it to clients. Because what I didn't like about 2003 is the whole concept was you had to put, if you had a different piece of information that you wanted to store different stuff about, you had to put it somewhere else. So organizations created 478,000 different document libraries to store documents. So content types allowed us to be able to have the flexibility of metadata, had allowed us to be able to do some discipline around that, saying you can only use this and you have to put in these fields, but allowed us to store lots of information in one place. So now if I was managing a project, I could have a single document library where I store my project plans, my project work items, my project budget, and all those different things in one place, because I could store different information around it and look at it differently. So content types has been around since 2007. Again, this is not something that people use a lot. Do you know why? Because just like the term store, everybody wants to over-engineer this. They want to say, well, but these two documents are different, so I should have two separate content types. Well, then these four over here are different. I've seen organizations try 10,000 content types in an organization, and they're like, the thing that we don't like about it is most people can't figure out what any of the 10,000 are. I said, well, did you ever consider you built 10,000 content types in that? So we have to use this again in moderation. It's a great way to think about standardizing content and standardizing the information that goes around it, but you have to be reasonable. So you have to be smart in the way you use this kind of stuff, but these can be both used in content creation. I personally love to use them in publishing informational scenarios where I can put lots of different information on the same page, have it all come from one system, but at the same time organize it in a unique way based off the content type. And then we have pages. This was another thing that wasn't very good before 2007 that 2007 actually brought in 2010, brought in here. So now we have the ability to kind of lay out pages the way we want. Don't forget that actually look and feel is a big part of information architecture, because you can have everything organized in a great way, but if nobody can understand the way the page looks, it doesn't really matter in that. And so we have this ability to be able to look at this. We can use our site pages in our pages library if we have the publishing feature, but we can create pages and we can actually add metadata to that. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite things to do in 2010 is to build page templates that are based off the page content type, add my metadata there. So let's say it's going to be a department page, just for an example, and I actually have a department piece of metadata there, and I say it's going to be finance. And then I have all this content that exists different places that have been part of finance, and I can pull all that content through Content Query Web Parts onto the page because the page has finance and those have finance. It's a very, very slick way to be able to do things very simply. Content types and pages work really great together. And the cool thing, again, when I talk about 2013, is it's actually easier to do. There's actually a piece that I'm going to mention that I thought was the stupidest thing they ever put into SharePoint that I actually love now. That's called the snippets library. And so then we have the most powerful piece in any good IA, and this is the Content Query Web Part. And is anybody in here in Foundation? Okay, good, because I was going to say you don't have this. But the cool thing is there's some really great vendors downstairs that have some really great parts that you can use in that place. But with the Content Query Web Part, you're able to pull any information inside a site collection and surface it up and be able to show it in a unified view. And if you get really, really good at this, you can do really complex queries around this and pull up information in really unique scenarios. So now you can build these page templates that use content types and Content Query Web Parts, and you can just add another page and it automatically populates itself because it knows what content needs to go in there. So this is where you get really powerful in these scenarios. But don't let me kid you, if you're going to modify these, it takes a lot of advanced understanding. You have to understand XSLT, you have to understand a lot about querying in XSLT, and it's not for the faint of heart. So again, in the next session, when you want to talk about one of the things I'm most excited about in 2013, is they use this brand new technology called HTML. It's really crazy because it ends up with that. It's a lot easier to do than XSL. So in there. But this is a very powerful piece of what goes in there. So for the last 5 minutes, I just kind of want to walk through an example, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about an information architecture. So this is an actual demo site that I built, and that it's called Monkey Madness. And yes, my company's name's Hi Monkey, so we do have a lot of monkey different things in that in there. It's a website built in SharePoint 2010. It includes a lot of solid content management practices, separation of content and presentation, which is very important. So we're showing information up on the home page in different screens, but we're actually, that information exists elsewhere down in the site collection. You're going to see a diagram of that. It has creative design elements. Obviously, you can't do a monkey site without having a cute monkey face, so it has an interesting monkey face, at least we'll say that in there. We're using managed navigation, so we're actually using that to do some of that stuff. And we have content query. So again, all these are content query web parts that roll up from different systems. So when we look at this, we look at it from a user perspective, and we say this is all really a user is seeing. They have a few pages. We have our Monkey Madness homepage there. We have our 4 different pages inside there, our doom document types, our crazy clients, our freaky functions, and our search page in that. So we have a very simple architecture. This is all a user would ever see on this site. They go to 4 pages, obviously not a really complex structure, but at the same time, it's very simple from them. But from an information architect side, I see this differently. I see how this content is organized in all the different pieces, and this is my structure of my content types. So I have, again, as a reminder for anybody that doesn't know a lot about content types, everything is an inheriting content type, so you can't just create your own and start anew, in that you're going to inherit from something, and so everything inherits from item, and then we're inheriting from document, page, and list item, and then we've got all the different types of pages that we have inside there. Well, this is what we work with in that. So this is what you think of as SharePoint. We have our sites, we have our lists, we have our libraries, we have all the different components there that make up the site. So this is where a content creator works, where they work on the different pieces of information and build it. So we have our parent site up here, Monkey Madness, where all this information exists, and then we have some additional sites down here where we're actually storing this stuff, so that when we actually go with the content query web part, we can pull that information up. And the great part about that is up here, this may be completely open to everybody, but down here, I'm limiting who can access these sites and do editing of content so that I can keep it separated. And then we have this piece. This is probably the most familiar thing in SharePoint. This is lists and libraries. So we always have to have places that we store it. One of my favorite things is to be able to store lots of information in one place. You always have to be interested. So you see I don't have separate things for all these different type of documents. I have one, and I use the content types to manage all the information that I want to store on the different types of contents. The same with the different things. So this is kind of what site admins do in kind of managing that site. So this is where a content creator is going to come, put their information so that it publishes up. And wow, that's, I got through them all, yes. So the important thing here to understand, and the reason I kind of break it out into those 4 different segments, is that you have all these different perspectives that go in an IA. You have what the users see, you have how the information architect, how you have to architect things to understand that information. You have the system that content creators are going to use, which can oftentimes be very, very different than what a user sees, which is great because content contributors, again, talking about that putability, giving them some kind of structure that they can put things into is a lot more reasonable than getting people to find stuff. And then we have the basis of that. And I know Fabian has a question, so I'm going to let him ask his question first.